everyone, and mahalo. And mahalo for joining us for Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month, Mythbusters edition. My name is Chuck Camara. I'm a weed risk assessment specialist and Hawaii Invasive Species Council support staff, and I will be your host for today's talk. Throughout the month of February, there will be a variety of in-person volunteer activities, webinars on various topics, awards presented to businesses and individuals who make a difference in addressing invasive species in Hawaii, and much more. In addition to our hot subject today, other talks this week will include a presentation tomorrow night at 6 p.m. entitled Invasive Plant Sales in the Islands, What You Learn Will Shock You. And on Friday at noon, there will be a presentation on biocontrol entitled Let's Talk About the Mongoose, Modern Biocontrol and Why We Need It. So you can check out the full schedule at the HiSam website, which I believe will be posted in the chat, or a link to that, to register for upcoming talks. And if you missed any of the presentations, or if you've already watched everything on Netflix and want to binge all the HiSam talks at the end of the month, links to the recordings will also be posted on the HiSam website. And we are also being broadcast live today on the Big Island Invasive Species Committee's Facebook page. Before I introduce our speaker today, I also wanted to acknowledge the technical support staff helping us with today's presentation. So with us today, we have Kavehi Young, BISC Community Engagement Liaison, and the artistic talent behind most of the beautiful HiSam graphics we've seen throughout the month. And I think she will also be monitoring Facebook if you have any questions that you're going to post there. We also have Jade Miyashiro, invasive arthropod expert with BISC, an all-around technical expert. So if anything goes wrong with today's presentation, it's my fault. But if everything goes smoothly, it's because of the expertise of Kavehi and Jade. And then rounding out the support staff today is Melissa Camara, Pacific Fire Exchange Program Coordinator, artist, mother, and definitely my better half, and not necessarily in that order. So finally, before I do introduce our speaker, we wanted to take a brief moment to have everyone fill out an online poll so we can get a little information about who's joining us today and where you are located. So I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, I think we're good with the poll, everybody. So thanks for taking time to fill that out. So finally, for today's main event, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. Elizabeth Pickett is co-executive director of the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, where she began working in 2008. Elizabeth works with staff and partners across the state and the Pacific region to implement wildfire mitigation, planning, and education projects. So through her time at HWMO, she has witnessed how important collaboration and inclusive processes are on all projects and believes such a coordinated and respectful approach is the pathway to wildfire readiness and resilience in Hawaii. So today, Elizabeth will be speaking about and busting wildfire myths in Hawaii. After the presentation, there should be some time to answer any burning questions you may have. I know I have one about the suspected link between space lasers and fire that I can't wait to ask. So I look forward to that at the end of Elizabeth's presentation. Mahalo, and you can take it away now, Elizabeth. Thanks.
Okay, aloha and good morning, everybody. I am going to just take a moment here to get my screen shared. Can I get a thumbs up if you can see that already? Okay, great. Then I'm going to go ahead and just enter full screen so we can see the whole slideshow. All right, so today, as Chuck mentioned, I'm going to be talking about myths about wildfire in Hawaii. Excuse me, I have been in the field of wildfire for about 15 years, and I have heard and witnessed a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to wildfire. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that in our state and in our region, wildfire has been increasing over the last several decades, and we are not all caught up to what the realities are. And so we're all on this learning path together. And so I'm really looking forward to unpacking some of these misunderstandings and myths that I hear frequently. So maybe some of you know the answers already, some of you aren't believers in these myths, and maybe some of this information will be new to you. So I hope that this is useful for everyone who's here today. I'm so thankful that you are. Okay, so I'll start off just by introducing myself. I am Elizabeth Pickett. I'm one of two co-executive directors at Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization. We are a nonprofit. We were formed in 2000, and we incorporated and became a nonprofit in 2002. So we've been working on wildfire issues for a very long time. And we started off on the west side of Hawaii Island. We grew to be island-wide, statewide, and now we're doing more and more across the Western Pacific. And our vision is for the people and places of Hawaii and the Pacific to be wildfire ready and wildfire resilient. And over the years, we've become a hub for all things wildfire, except for suppression. We do not fight fires, but we do a lot of prevention, education, mitigation, planning. We build partnerships, and we do a lot of collaborative work. And our approach has always been to be proactive, to be collaborative, to be multi-partner, work across sectors and professions, to protect communities and natural resources holistically, and to really aim to be forward-thinking in all we do. That said, before I get really started, I did want to say thank you to our hosts. We are so thankful that wildfire is being included in this month of amazing talks and webinars as part of Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month. So thank you to Hawaii Invasive Species Council and to the Big Island Invasive Species Council for your support in highlighting wildfire and all the great and important work that you do throughout the year and years that you operate. I also wanted to say thank you to our funders who believe that wildfire is a priority for Hawaii and the Pacific. And that includes our federal partners at the Forest Service and Joint Fire Science, to our state partners at the legislature and Forestry and Wildlife, all the way to our county, and lots of private foundations and other folks who support the wildfire work that we do in Hawaii. These lessons learned and the myths that I'm going to be busting today are a result of hearing from folks on the ground as I implemented, or our staff implemented, projects that our funders funded. And so a lot of what you're hearing today is this cumulative wisdom and information and myth busting that we've come together to share in a packaged way from all these projects that have happened on the ground. So thank you to our funders for allowing that learning to take place on our side so that we can continue to share and provide some information. So I wanted to start this off with busting some myths about wildfire causes. And this is really important because cause is also connected to responsibility. So who causes fires kind of leads us in this natural human way to think about who's responsible. And so it's really important that we understand the true causes of wildfire. So I have some myths that I'll be sharing that I have heard frequently when it comes to misunderstandings about wildfire causes. So the first myth that I have heard a lot is when people say, well, there's nothing we can do, or that we don't really have to care so much because wildfires are an inevitable fact of nature. And the truth is, in Hawaii, that's not exactly true. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but I'm going to highlight those along the way. So something that people should know is that 99% of our wildfires in Hawaii are caused by humans. We do have fires caused by lightning and caused by lava, excuse me. I should mention that I'm just getting over being sick, so you might hear me do that a bit. But we have fires that are started most of the time by humans. And this is really important because it's not just some natural issue that is natural in Hawaii, it's not. And so this helps us know that actually we're responsible, we're causing it, and maybe human-caused fires can have human solutions. That said, along that same idea about human-caused fire, we hear a lot that people think it's always or almost always from arson. And that is not true either. we do have arson. We have about 25% of our fires occurring from arson, but about 75% are actually accidents. And that's really important to note for the same reason that I mentioned before, which is that when we know what the real cause is, we can come up with a real solution, and we know whose responsibility it really is. It's not just those arsonists setting fires all the time. We actually haven't caught up with our fire risk in terms of our choices, our behaviors, how we use our barbecues and how we do campfires and all those ways that fires start. We have a lot of accidents that have led to our big fires. So that's really important to remember. Another myth, similar, is that it's cigarettes. Those are the problems. That's what's causing the problem. And again, it's not all arsonists and it's not all cigarettes. It's actually other kinds of accidents. So that is not fact. That is fiction. It's actually somewhat hard in most circumstances to start a wildland fire with a cigarette. It's not impossible. It does happen, but it's actually more rare than what we know are the primary causes of accidental ignitions in Hawaii. So the truth is, what causes our fires, our accidental fires, meaning again, 75% of our fires in Hawaii are vehicles driving, parking, idling on dry grass, especially. So pulling over on the side of the road where there's grass, driving through a field. And this includes on-road vehicles, off-road vehicles, and even accidents and car fires that might ignite nearby vegetation. So vehicles are a huge source of wildfire. So please pull over only where it's hardened, dirt, gravel, etc., but not on dry grass. Another common accidental ignition source are campfires, where they've either escaped or people didn't put them out adequately, and they have been left to smolder and eventually come back to life and then throw sparks and then ignite nearby vegetation. Equipment is another cause of accidental ignitions, and this spans everything from grinders, welders, poorly maintained mowers and weed whackers, all the way up through arcing, sparking power equipment. So equipment in general, especially if it's poorly maintained or it has the potential to spark or send sparks out there or otherwise ignite nearby vegetation. This is a huge issue across the world, really, in fire-prone areas, but equipment is a huge source of accidents. And then finally, fireworks. And for the same reason, sparks flying in wind is never really a good idea. So these are the real sources of wildfire in Hawaii. Like I said, we have some natural ignitions and we have some arson, but these are really the majority of wildfire starts. And to me, this is very hopeful because it's actually something that we can do something about if we all catch up in our behaviors to the risk we really see on the ground. So now I want to dive into some myths about fire on the landscape, how it travels, what causes it, what impacts the fires might have, because there are a lot of misunderstandings and kind of complex things to think about in terms of being able to understand what's happening with wildfire and how it impacts our local environments. So the first myth I want to talk about is this idea that we need fire for ecosystem health and function. And that is true in some environments, but not ours. That is not our story. So nope, that myth is not a reality for us in Hawaii. Our systems are very different. They are not adapted to fire like, say, the African savanna or our pine forests on the mainland. Our story is much different. And in Hawaii, damage spreads quickly from summit to sea. We have impacts on our air, our land, our water. We have catastrophic impacts to our irreplaceable natural resources. And we even have impacts to human health and safety. In Hawaii, our systems are not, they don't regenerate and recover and get even healthier after a fire. They're actually just devastated. The soil burns, the seed bank burns, the trees don't come back fast, if they ever come back. Our story is not the story of the American West. We have a totally different ecology. And in Hawaii, we have all these other impacts as well. We have during fire smoke, we have after fire dust, and that has to do a lot with the changes that happen to our soil when they burn and how it's so easy to suspend our soils as airborne sediment, and also because we have such frequent heavy winds, it suspends it even easier after fire. We have post-fire erosion that leads to sediment plumes, and we have these big rain events that lead to, erosion and all that dirt going into our nearshore areas, as you can see in the top right photo. And it smothers our coral reefs and impacts that ecology. So these are all natural systems that are not adapted to fire, that are heavily impacted. So our story is that fire can be devastating to our natural environment. And just for comparison, we all know what a healthy reef in Hawaii looks like, or I hope you all do. Hope you've been able to see that. But you can measure and observe the difference between what a healthy reef looks like and one that's been subject to post-fire erosion. So next myth. A lot of times I hear, well, yeah, there was a fire, but the grass burned and now it's growing right back. That's not a big deal. It's not, no harm, no foul. And actually that is not so true. So we really need to take a deeper look to understand that. And really, it starts off with really understanding how fire works and what impacts it has on the landscape. And over the years, we've really started to understand what this grass fire cycle is on Pacific Islands. And what happens is, the grass burns. We have been invaded by, fire-prone invasive grass and other species. And that's why we're part of this Invasive Species Awareness Month. And, we have grass that leads up to our communities, grass that leads up to our more intact forested areas. And what happens is fire travels across that grass, and the fire is carried along these grass-dominated areas to the edge of the forest. And what happens then is that forest edge burns, and the tree dies, the seed bank burns, the soil gets charred and turns waxy and no longer allows water to penetrate. A lot of changes happen from those fires. And then what comes back is not more trees. We don't have regeneration of our native trees after fire. Instead, if there are any surviving and viable seeds that are trying to grow, they're outcompeted by our invasive grasses. And so over time, we lose forest edge, grass comes in. We lose the next forest edge, grass comes in. So we have more and more grass, more and more fire risk, less and less forest with each subsequent burn and each subsequent fire. And this has, impacted our forests to a really significant degree. So you can see, more visually what that looks like. You can see what our dryland forest species and forests might look like, or do look like, where they're intact and less damaged. And you can see what happens when you have, 100% grass conversion. And this is not natural. This is not a healthy, ecosystem in the way that is full of native species. This is a fire destroyed, invaded landscape. And what we're trying to do is keep what we have in place intact and protected from fire, and to interrupt that grass fire cycle through mitigation. Another myth that comes up all the time is, okay, we have fires, but ours are really small and they just don't have those big impacts like they do in places like California. And to that, I say there are lots of ways to think about this. We could think in acre numbers. And of course, then, the American West has giant fires with really large acreage burned, and they are devastating and hugely impacting. So it's not to minimize that. But when you think about Hawaii and other island areas and smaller states, it might not be about the number of acres. It's more about the impacts and the percentage or the proportion of the land area that burns. So we have done some work in collecting fire records across our agencies to understand how much percentage of total land area across our state has burned over time. And we've worked with Clay Charnick at the University of Hawaii to analyze these records. And, for that first batch of records and data that we analyzed, we uncovered the real story, which is that if you look at the proportion of our land area that burns every year, and that's the average percentage is the dot, and the line represents the variability year to year, you can see that for that period of time that we first looked at, Hawaii is on average frequently above the percentage total of land area that burns every year than any of the westernmost fire-prone states, and certainly above the average across the entire United States. Like, we are one of the most fire-prone states. And we thought, well, you know, those records and that analysis didn't actually include the more recent years of mega fires in the West. So we wondered how we stack up compared to that, and also what other Pacific Islands are facing. And so that's where, you know, we look at this next analysis and we're like, okay, well, some years Hawaii is still, you know, ramping up and having a lot of proportion of our state burn to match or exceed the westernmost fire-prone states, even with all those, you know, increases in fire acreage. And if you look across the Pacific and other Pacific Islands, it's off the charts. So it's not really nothing. It's actually a really big deal that we're having these big fires. Even big for us might not be big for places like, you know, Washington and California, and Idaho, et cetera. So it's a big deal to us. And what happens are all these impacts. Some of them I already talked about, like loss of natural resource health and function, loss of native species, loss of forest, downstream impacts, erosion, sedimentation, impacts to our streams, coral reef, fisheries, recreation, sustenance, tourism, water quality, et cetera. And then, but we also have these more municipal city community impacts. We have traffic during fire, we have road closures. Fires are very expensive to our tax money in our county, state, and federal budgets. Lives are endangered, firefighter lives, community lives, municipal infrastructure. Homes and communities are now at risk because those fire-prone grasslands have surrounded unprepared communities. And these are significant and not to be minimized because maybe our acre numbers are lower. Another myth that I hear often is, oh, you know, I live on the wet side. I don't have to worry about fire. There's only fire on the leeward side or on dry sides. And I get where that's coming from, definitely, because we have had a lot of large fires on our leeward sides. But actually, that's not the story. That is not 100% how it works. Fire happens depending, like how fire is happening and what's going on with fire depends a lot on what's going on with climate, people by way of human caused ignitions, and vegetation. And in Hawaii, we have these heavy rainfall periods where there's lots of vegetation that grows, followed by drought and dry periods. We have increases in human caused ignitions, and we have this expansion that I talked about of our grassland areas that are very fire prone. So it's just a recipe for having fire. And under the right conditions, anywhere can burn. And we know that, especially when we think about the fact that in order to have fire or wildfire even happen, you need something to ignite it. You need an ignition, and you need something to be burned, you know, something to combust, some vegetation, some fuel, some combustible material. And that's all you really need. You need, you know, and it needs to be, you know, dry enough to carry fire. So a lot of our biggest fires happen on the west sides, but what you're looking at here is a fire history map that shows where all the fire ignitions have occurred, where there has been a fire and it required fire department or fire suppression response. And these are fires that were ignited and were burning, and firefighters had to go put them out. And you can see they're happening on all sides of all islands, wet or dry. And the point I want to make here is really that, yes, we have our biggest fires where there is uninterrupted contiguous vegetation and it's all primed and dry for fire, to carry fire. And that tends to be on the leeward sides or where it's most dry. But the truth is, we're having more and more drought events and more periods of dry, even on the wet sides. And there's so much more vegetation there to burn. And we know we're having all these ignitions already happening. And so under the right conditions, we can have fire anywhere. And we've seen that happen. And these records also were for a 10-year period that ended in 2012. So I wanted to just check and see, you know, is this still the case? Are we still having lots of fires happen on the windward side of our islands? And this is just from fire department records from the last 5 years for Hawaii Island. And indeed, you can look along the whole entire windward and high elevation areas that typically receive more rain. And yet we are still having fires that require a fire suppression response. And if those happen when it's dry, there's a lot of vegetation to burn in those areas, and they can get big. Case in point, last summer or the summer before, we had a huge fire on the Hamakua coast, 1,500 acres. Pauilo was burning, and you can see the type of vegetation that was burning. It was more lush. It wasn't necessarily all grass. There was grass in the area that did burn, ignite, etc. But it's not always in grass dominated areas, and fires can happen on our more wet areas when those wet areas get more dry. And we have seen that happen, and the projections show that we will have areas that are getting drier and drier that, you know, in the past had more precipitation than they will have. And this is not a new story of our windward sides burning. In 1901, we had a 30,000 acre enormous fire happen on the Hamakua. And you can see more about that story. It's pretty cool. It was the beginning. This fire was the beginning of the development of our, you know, Division of Land or Department of Land and Natural Resources and Division of Forestry and Wildlife. It led to the creation of those. But this is, you know, more than 100 years ago, we were having big fires on our dry side. So when the conditions are right, and especially where we already have ignitions and we have lots of fuel to burn and it gets dry, we should be really aware and not complacent, knowing that our windward sides can burn. Another myth here that's related, which is not just where fires burn, but when. That this idea that wildfires only happen in the summer, that again, nope, that's not the case. Case in point, there's a fire burning right now. This is a copy of the civil defense message that just came on Hawaiʻi Island. We have a fire right now that's burning, and it's upwards of 1,500 acres also. And, you know, it's big and it's saturated all around, but it happens to be in a drier section that hasn't gotten precipitation this winter. So really, we have a year-round fire season. It doesn't mean everywhere has high fire risk at all times, but somewhere in Hawaii is dry enough to burn almost all year long. And then, of course, we do have a drier period where there is less precipitation, so more of Hawaii is at risk. And so we go back and forth between saying fire season, because what we mean by that is that time when a lot of Hawaii is at risk, but actually, you know, it only takes a few days for things to dry out enough to carry fire. And we know we have ignitions happening all the time. So really, our mindset has been shifting more and more to the fact that we have a year-round fire season. Another myth that's worth busting is that idea that, like, oh, we're getting rain, things are turning green, we don't have to worry about wildfire. Sort of. Mostly false, tiny bit true. The true part is that maybe you won't see active flames on saturated land and saturated high humidity sort of times in vegetation. But how much fuel is available to burn later when it all dries out is a result of the rain and the growth and the green up that happens during those rain events. So those rain events are totally related to the fire risk we see in the future. And then the other part of to note is that actually when we're not in such high risk of actual flames burning on the ground, that's the time to make a mitigation plan, to implement projects, to do your vegetation management, to plan for and train for wildfire prevention for staff, employees, for your family, practice your emergency plan, you know, get your yard work done. This is the time to do it. So, you know, thinking through, we're only a few days out from things being dry enough to burn. We can use those times strategically to take action and to get ahead of things instead of always being, you know, one step behind and at risk. Myth number 10, grass fires aren't as big a deal as forest fires. And again, you know, it's in the eye of the beholder. It's true that, you know, trees, thick, big trees burn slower and longer than flashy, fast-moving fires through grass. But the truth is, the fact that we would say they're not as big a deal or they're not as dangerous is just totally wrong. Grass fires can be extremely fast moving. You know, even recently we have had winds up to 60 miles an hour for several days in a row. And oftentimes, while this was in winter, a lot of times that happens when it is drier. And so the length of our flames in grasses can be like 30 feet, 60 feet, all depending on the wind. They're dangerous. They threaten lives and homes and communities. Our firefighters' lives and safety. It threatens natural resources. These are still really significant events that have a lot of danger and a lot of need for mitigation and suppression. And just they can do a lot of damage and be pretty scary. So, the home on the left that's burning happened in 2018, right after Hurricane Lane. There was a big fire. There's set of fires all over the state, but this is a picture from there were 30 structures that burned in the Lahaina area. And on the right, you can see a fire being fought on Saddle Road on Hawaii Island. And the wind was coming from so many, different directions that it caused the grass fire flames to turn into a fire tornado. And our fire responders actually had to get in their vehicles and evacuate just for their own safety. So grass fires can be pretty serious, even if they're not, big pine tree stands that are burning. Another myth is thinking that fuel breaks and fire breaks 100% stop fires. You put that in, you don't have to take any action. You're totally safe. And that's all you have to do. That is a myth. That is actually only part of the story. The rest of the story is that, flames only burn. Flames and fire spread in several ways. The first is through direct flame contact. And that is, as the flames travel and preheat the next thing and ignite it and preheat the next thing. And so you have this moving along of fire. And but there are, and that's actually why you put in a fuel or fire break, because that is where, the active traveling of fire across the land slows or gets stopped by these fuel breaks or fire breaks. It reduces the extreme fire behavior and the fast spread. However, fire also can be ignited and spread through radiant heat and through embers that travel, even up to a mile or more and start new fires wherever they land. And so what happens is, we have to have multifaceted mitigation and suppression efforts, just because fire travels in lots of ways. But the fuel and fire breaks help. But what they also do is they provide access for firefighting. So you can see on that picture on the bottom, the fuel break that you see there, the fire break, is actually one that was our organization's very first project in 2005. And it was only within like a week of installing that fire break that the biggest fire to date in history at that time, 38,000 acres, came all the way from Waimea on Hawaii Island and came that far. And it was the only thing that allowed firefighters to get in and protect the community from the oncoming fire and to deal with those other ways that fire spread. So fire and fuel breaks are helpful, they're important, they're necessary, they're effective, but they're not perfect. So they help, but there's other things that need to be done too. And a lot of times you can design fuel breaks and fire breaks to optimize access and to serve other fire mitigating purposes as well. So just to clarify that it's a part of a bigger picture of activities that need to happen to suppress fire. So another myth, and now we're over halfway through, much over halfway. This idea that vegetation management on a landscape doesn't work and doesn't reduce fire, or maybe the myth is the other, that it always works and always does the perfect job. There's a lot of, people end up in a lot of places on this, and it's really important to understand that it's complex, it's situational, it's based on topography. There's a lot going on here that we have to understand. And so to think it just doesn't work or it's not worth doing is, it's something that requires a little bit more investigation to understand the complexities and the nuances that we're dealing with when we're doing vegetation management to mitigate fire risk and fire spread. So an important thing to understand is that how a wildfire behaves depends on lots of things. It depends on topography, it depends on the weather, it depends on the fuels or the vegetation. And within each of those, there are lots of other aspects that are going on. When it comes to topography, fires burn faster uphill. They burn hotter and more intensely in canyons and in gulches. Depending on if it's north facing or south facing slope, you have vegetation that's going to be drier or not. So how a fire moves across those vegetation with different humidity levels is going to impact how the fire moves as well. And then when it comes to weather, there's not a lot we can do but about wind, temperature, humidity, precipitation, etc. And all of those factors come into play when a fire is taking place. So in a low to medium intensity fire, the fuels management makes a huge difference. we are able to manipulate how a fire travels across the landscape, and if it is able to, by what we do and provide for fuel in its path. Fires can only burn where there is fuel to burn. And so there's a lot we can do to influence that. That said, it's again not perfect, because we have no control over topography and weather. And in heavy winds and certain topographic features, fires are kind of unstoppable. They can burn and spread very quickly, especially in 60-mile-an-hour wind. I mean, that's where even if you've mitigated and you've reduced or you've mowed or you've grazed and the vegetation or the grass is super short or very sparse, those embers are being thrown at 60 miles an hour. They can go really far. They can find the little spots that are burnable, and the fire can spread very rapidly. So that's where it's very nuanced, because in low to medium fires, all those actions probably would really be helpful. And then in some fires, it's just, they're so intense and so severe that you're going to have to do all those other types of prescriptions and operations and firefighting techniques and all sorts of things to address and deal with those adequately. And so again, it's not that it always works or that it never works. It's kind of influenced by what's going on and the weather during the fire event and the landscape and all sorts of features. But if we can do something about fuel, and 80% of the time it really makes a difference, it's still something worth investing in. And it's something that, you know, it's the part that we actually can do something about. So it's something that is worth our time and energy, attention, money, etc. in doing. All right, so now we move on to the final section. This is a section that's kind of near and dear to my heart, about who should be doing what can be done, etc. And this is where you know, the part that falls onto all of us, no matter what profession or sector or interest you came here today with. We all need to be thinking about this. So that myth that the fire department is responsible for all things related to fire, that is not true. It's pretty unrealistic. So all the things we need to do to mitigate risk, we need to not start fires. There's no way we have enough firefighters to be with us or be in our heads every minute to address every barbecue, every campfire, every time we're driving, where we drive, if we swept our lanai, if we cleaned out our rain gutters, if we trimmed our trees, if we mowed our grasses, if we made and practiced an emergency plan. Yeah, that's up to other people. That's not up to our firefighters. It's up to us. So it's pretty unrealistic to think like, I don't have to think about fire. That's what I have a fire department for. So really, what we need to think of it, like this, that firefighting is the last line of defense. They are there when everything else went wrong, and there are active flames spreading across the land and impacting, you know, our communities and our environment. So it's an essential role. It is important what firefighters do. We need to support them and advocate for our firefighting agencies to have everything they need to do an amazing job. And they do a very robust and effective job in Hawaii, but we can't leave it all up to them. So with that thought, that's where we land on this important sort of concept. And we need to shift to a culture among our communities and within Hawaii where we know this to be true and we act this way, that everyone has a role. From our civic leaders to our business owners to developers, architects, engineers, our planning departments, our legislators, our people making budgets and policy, all the way to the folks who steward lands and waters, and our land managers and homeowners who caretaking for their family and for their house, and residents, who can all be a part of the solution. So this is really important to shift over from, doesn't the fire department do that, to, oh, we all have a part to do and we should make sure we're doing it. And our friends and partners at the Fire Adapted Communities Network at the national level have put together lots of cool graphics like the one you just saw, and then this one to think through, like, who all needs to be involved in adapting to the real-time, real-life fire risk that that communities and the built environment are facing. And you can see it involves all the things I said, plus public health and utilities and academia and farmers and ranchers and tourism, in addition to the things you usually think about, like foresters, firefighters, and maybe civil defense or emergency management. The picture is way bigger than that for all the things that need to be concurrently addressed to really face our wildfire risk at the level it needs to be to make us all, get us all safer and into a more of a practice of what it takes to deal with our risk and not start fires and address it properly at the level that we're really facing. So we're at a similar sort of myth when we hear from folks saying like, well, I don't have to worry about things because the fire department's totally going to protect my home, even during a large wildfire event. Or a related myth when people are really angry and hurt and offended and betrayed, and sometimes even, you know, suing and lawsuits and things like that, when they're saying like, the fire department didn't come and have their whole crew in front of my house or my farm. And the truth is, sometimes that's just not going to be possible. You know, I think our firefighters do an outstanding job of protecting lives and homes and property. But the truth is, and the fact is that in the majority of wildfires, that will be the case. Homes will be protected, lives and safety prioritized. But some wildfires grow so large and so fast with such heavy winds and such fire intensity, the fire department may not have enough resources to protect every single home and every single inch of ground. And an important factor in determining if they will be able to do so is how much preparation has been done, how well the home is prepared. You can imagine if it was your job and there's one or two of you to protect a home, it's going to be a lot easier to be successful if that home has its vegetation maintained and has the trees off of the roof and not touching the roof. And it's all shored up with non-combustible materials and it's swept and there aren't leaf piles catching all over the place and having lots of little fires all over. There's a lot that we need to do to make it possible for our homes and our lands to be protected. And on that front, I just wanted to share a few realities that maybe help put all of that into perspective. So it's challenging to fight wildfires in Hawaii. You know, many or most of our communities have only one way in and out. So access is really challenging. As our firefighters are getting into a community, everyone else is trying to get out. There's a lot of congestion and traffic. And there's not a lot of access or perimeter fuel breaks around our neighborhoods that are adjacent to wildland areas. So there's not a lot of easy access. There's a lot of retrofitting work that we have to do because our areas were not designed with wildfire safety in mind when they were developed. We have a lot, I don't know if it's the majority, but a ton of our wildfires take place in areas where there's no water. And so you can imagine it's a lot easier to fight fire when you have adequate water resources available and they're infinite, as opposed to limited to 2 helicopters with small buckets and people hiking out or putting up temporary ponds and trucking in water. And we don't have a lot of water infrastructure to adequately meet our firefighting needs in Hawaii. We also we're not like on the mainland where there's CAL FIRE or the Forest Service, or where there are these active cadres of wildland firefighting specialists, and they have all the resources and they can pull resources from across the entire continent to help. We don't have that in Hawaii. And so, you know, our firefighters make do and do an amazing job. But that's where it's important, where we do our part by preventing and mitigating, you know, to help keep them safe and able to safely and effectively fight fire. And it's also important to know that even legislation, policy, money, budgets kinds of levels, we also haven't caught up to our real risk and our real need. For several years where we've had big fire years, we've overspent the budget set aside for wildland fire before we were even halfway through that drier period when a lot of Hawaii is at risk. So we have a lot to do in terms of retrofitting, working on our built environment, working on our policies, working on our capacity and our personnel, equipment, training, access, water. Like the fact that we have had such success in suppressing our wildland fires as we have, given those challenges, is really amazing. But we need to cut our firefighters a little slack when we're really angry that they didn't put all their resources on our one house or our one area, because it's a real challenge. And they're putting their lives on the line in order to do this. So I wanted to also point out that because of the challenges or in spite of them, maybe, our many county, state, and federal agencies and even some large landowners work together amazingly well. They have really strong collaborations, really solid teamwork. And even I've been a part of a lot of national meetings and groups, and I've heard over and over again that people admire and wish they had the level and degree of collaboration and cooperation that we have here in Hawaii. So I don't want it to all be like a doomsday scenario, because people are used to making do and doing really well with whatever they have. And that is the case, for firefighting. And we can be really proud of that. And it inspires me, at least, to do as much as I can to support that in all the ways we've talked about: preventing ignitions, mitigating risk, mitigating vegetation, advocating for policies and budgets that support them, and all the mitigation work, because and even more suppression and equipment and training and access and water. So you'll hear me say those things over and over again, because that's the reality. And just because I haven't reached a place where I feel like everybody owns this, knows it, shares it, etc., please help us share that firefighting is the last line of defense. Like, these are the talking points, so that we can all be sharing the message and people can hear it over and over again from all sorts of ways, that it's up to us, not to start fires. And remember, it's like putting barbecues and campfires out cold, not using sparking equipment when it's dry and windy, maybe reconsidering if and when you use fireworks. Don't drive and pull over and idle on dry grass. Manage vegetation around your home, your yard, on your landscape, and be an advocate for all this kind of work. So we're on to our last couple of myths. The first is this idea that your home will catch on fire only from flames burning right up to the structure. And so I can go through this quickly because we talked about it a little bit already, but that's not true. And we go back to that idea that there's a lot of ways that fire spreads. So when you're doing your risk reduction work around your home, you have to keep in mind that the majority of our wildfire starts happen from ember storms or ember ignitions. And research across the US and elsewhere shows that embers, which are bits of airborne burning vegetation, are the primary cause of homes catching on fire from nearby wildfires. And they can travel way ahead of flames, and they'll land, these embers land all over the place. And what you want to make sure you're doing is making it impossible for them to land on anything that would smolder and ignite. So piles of leaves, combustible materials, etc. So that's where it's really important to understand what counts as combustible. Piles of leaves, pine needles, firewood, mulch. And this can be on the ground, under trees, under the bushes, all gathered up, under your windows, around your home, in your rain gutters, in your eaves, in the nooks and crannies on your roof, and also thinking through things like lawn furniture that has foam pillows, dog beds, log piles, other combustible things like propane tanks, etc. If an ember lands on or ignites something nearby where that it can ignite one of these combustible piles or materials, you're in trouble, because now you've had this ember ignition causing like a home and yard fire. And also thinking through other ways embers can get in and cause damage, and ways you can interrupt that by protecting all these things. Embers can enter your home through vents, and so you can actually put up screening to make it so that the embers might hit the vent, but they won't go in. Same thing, close your windows, dual pane windows. Embers can easily get into your house and burn it from the inside out if they get into your house. So single pane windows, if a bush is burning really hot underneath it, they can crack and let embers in. But also, if we leave our windows open and maybe we don't have screen in, or it melts and opens up, embers can get into the house. And same thing with open windows on cars. So these are all the kinds of things to think about if there's a wildfire occurring nearby, or if we want to be preparing and cleaning our home and yard and prepping it so that we don't promote any sort of ember ignitions around our house. Also, there's a lot of people I've heard like, oh, wildfires are just so unpredictable and scary. There's nothing I can do to protect my home. And to that, I just want to say, yeah, there's a lot you can do. And some of those things are replacing combustible materials with non-combustible materials, or, reducing the flammable vegetation around your home and removing the combustible things like I talked about, and really just cleaning it up and making it nice and neat and able to withstand embers. You can plant or xeriscape to reduce how much maintenance and how much leaf litter drops and how much water things need all around your home. We recommend a lot of native Firewise plants, but there are a lot of ways to make it so you don't always have to be maintaining to keep it low fire risk. And there's a lot of information in the Ready, Set, Go community action guide, and that's available on our website, hawaiiwildfire.org. We also have tons of copies in the office we can mail you if you want one. So get in touch with us if you are interested in learning all those tips and tricks. And there's also a community program that supports you working with your neighbors to reduce risk, not just at your home, but also everyone doing their work around their own homes, and also addressing common area and perimeter risks, increasing communication, encouraging lots more action, raising awareness, etc. There are 15 communities across the state, 3 more on the way. This is a great program, and there's a lot of empowering risk reduction action that happens from the Firewise program. So the idea that you could use an irrigation system to defend your home is another reality check I want to give, which makes us all really nervous, because when you use a hose or your irrigation system at the last minute, it's not always effective because you might not have the water pressure needed to combat really strong flames. Sometimes you have no water pressure, no electricity, or you even take away water pressure from the fire operation. So it's just not recommended. You also risk a very late evacuation, which is when fatalities sometimes happen. Or you turn into a search and rescue and take, resources off the fire. So the best method you have is to help your home resist fire through early preparation and maintenance. We're down to our last 2 myths here. So this one here is that, you might think, okay, I've done all that work. I'm Firewise. I've created defensible space around my home. I don't have to worry. If they say to evacuate, I don't have to evacuate. Maybe I'll use my hose, or maybe I'll just stay late. There's not really, I've done my preparation. So even though we say do your preparation, that's to protect your house. It's not necessarily to protect you. And so again, we embrace and use the national program Ready, Set, Go, and the tenets within it, which include being ready. So that's making and practicing your family or neighbor evacuation plan, having go bags, having your emergency plan all ready and developed. Hardening your home, that's the replacing combustible with non-combustible building materials, and doing that vegetation maintenance. Set is to stay aware. So notice when the vegetation is drying out, as you drive around, and notice when it's getting drier, and making sure you have done your preparation work seasonally or as needed. And also, if there's a fire nearby, pay attention, know what's happening with it, and use that spiny sense you have to just get out early if you're nervous at all. But definitely follow credible sources of information. So sign up for your emergency management and civil defense alerts, because that's where the real information is. They are making careful assessments constantly. All they do is exist to make sure people stay safe and life and property is protected. They're the ones who know. So please listen to them about what's going on with the fire and whether you need to evacuate or not. But the Ready, Set, Go program says, don't wait for an evacuation order. Don't be part of the traffic that's leaving those one-way in and out areas. Go early, go to the beach, go to the mall, go to dinner. You can always go back home, but at least you won't be a part of that traffic and evacuation problem, because you can go with the safety and security of knowing you did all the work, you prepared, you're Firewise. Embers, no big thing. There's very little it could land on to burn around your house and home. You're ready. And now you can just leave early and have that peace of mind that your home is safe and you yourself and your family are safe. So these are important things to remember, and not to stay late or think that you need to have a hose going at the last minute. It's way better and safer and important that you do that work ahead of time. So the final myth here, which is good because I'm running up against the timeline, is that wildfire is like other natural hazards, which is that as much as we do and learn and try how hard we try, we just can't really do much. But for fire, not the case. It's not like a flood or a hurricane or something where you really have no say. Remember, fire can only follow fuel. So actually, there's a lot we can do to reduce fire. We can make sure we're not starting them, and 75% are started by us. So we can stop doing that. And we can encourage our friends and neighbors to know how to be a part of that solution. And we can manage our fuel. And when we don't have an ignition or there's nothing to burn, we won't have wildfires. And so it's the one natural hazard that we have a lot of say over. So with that, I'll say our takeaways and be done. But there was a lot of information. So if you remember nothing else, remember this, that nearly all wildfires are caused accidentally. Firefighting is the last line of defense. We all have a role to play. Once Hawaiian ecosystems burn, they don't recover, and that causes damages to land, sea, and air. And there's a lot you can do to protect your home, your family, your community, and all of our natural resources from wildfire. So thank you for being part of the solution. There's just so much more protection and possibility for protection and safety when everybody participates proactively. And by coming here today and being a part of this talk, you're doing that. So thank you so much. And so when it comes to myths about wildfire, I hope you feel like they have been busted. And with that, I'll just say thank you, and I'll open it up for any questions that you might have for the last few minutes here.
Wow, thanks so much, Elizabeth, for such an educational and myth-busting talk. I kept typing down questions that I wanted to ask, and you anticipated just about every one I had, including the one about I live in a wet area, which I do, and that you don't have to worry about fire. And since Melissa started working with you folks, I definitely was paying more attention to the vegetation around my house, including the invasive plants like guinea grass and molasses grass that I know are just like a little mini drought away from becoming a very combustible fuel source. So it's a good reminder for even the people that live on the wet side, take a look around and see what could be a future cause for concern. I haven't seen any questions come in through the chat yet, other than like one more comment. Thanking you for your talk. Somebody who witnessed a wildfire in Dillingham Ranch Mountain in Range in June 2017 while teaching a horse riding, started from some people joyriding and pulling over and letting their trucks idle in the dry grass. We almost had to evacuate all the horses. My son is 22 now, and part of the reason he became a firefighter here. So she said, thank you for the great work you've been doing with your organization.
Oh, that's a great comment. It makes me realize, like, we have all these other workshops and programs we give. Today was just myths. But, we put on a lot of educational workshops throughout the year on FireWise to become, a FireWise community. But also what this brought up for me is that in the Ready, Set, Go workshop, we go through all the things to think about and consider. And so if you hear nothing else and you don't attend any of those, when you're doing your planning for evacuation and emergency preparedness, you have to just remember to think about neighbors in need, and also every animal that you have. Where's it going to go? Do you have what you need to transport them? Is that all set up, etc.? Food and prescriptions and all the things you need for humans, you need for animals too. And a lot of times people forget that piece, and then it's tragic because they'll stay in place even though they thought they were going to leave, because they realize they don't have a plan for their animals. So I'm glad that came up, because it didn't come up in this, what we just did, but there's a lot of like bits and pieces like that are really good to think about ahead of time.
Well, that was great, Elizabeth. Sorry, Chuck.
No, go ahead.
Just want to say I've been working with you now for almost, 3 years or something. And I definitely learned some new things today. That was like, you talking about fuels reduction over the landscape, and that topography and weather play a part, and you can do all of that. But in the really big ones, maybe depending on conditions, that may or may not work. And I'm just like, can you speak more to the times? Because you said, that fuels management done across, like grazing to reduce blazing, for example, done at scale can really make a huge difference in the majority. And maybe speak a little bit more to that for especially for the land stewards listening.
Oh yeah, I mean, I know there's a lot of we could do a whole session on myth busting for grazing. There's different kinds of animals. There's domestic versus wild. There's feral, etc. But when we talk about grazing for fuels reduction, it's properly managed, domesticated animals, shepherded strategically to reduce fuels. That's the kind of grazing that I'm talking about. And when that is done with an eye toward mitigating fuels, we have lots of models and examples of when fire burns through. it's like if you had a tiny little stack of pine needles versus like a whole campfire built that's going to be, or bonfire built. When you have less to burn, you're going to have less of a big fire. But it doesn't mean that when it's traveling sideways with heavy winds, that it won't just keep moving forward, even if it's not as intense. In those really big fires with really fast wind, the fire will still travel, even if it's not as intense and there isn't as much to burn, etc. And so there's a difference between how intensely it burns and how long it stays there versus if it's able to just skip across really fast. And so when we manage fuels with grazing or with anything else, we should know that we are doing good. We are mitigating the risk. We are reducing fuel. Therefore, not as much combustion is going to happen, etc. But to think that it'll never keep traveling because we've done that, we start to get problems where people say, well, grazing doesn't work, or limbing and trimming or thinning a forest doesn't work. And it's just like, well, that's in the majority of times it will. But the thing is, sometimes when the wind is pushing it, we can skip ahead and the fire can still be advancing, even if the fire itself isn't intense and it's like not as impacting. So, it's like threading the needle to really understand what's at play. And so we did reduce what was burning and how intense it was, but you can't reduce the embers and reduce the wind and make it go downhill when it's going uphill and all these things. So it's just like, it's a big piece, but it's not the only thing going on.
Yeah, thanks for that.
We do have, I know we're a little overtime right now, so if folks have to go, feel free to exit, but we did have one comment in the Q&A, and it says, another myth: if you see or smell smoke, the Hawaii Fire Department is already aware of the fire and is responding. Not always true in rural places, right, Elizabeth?
Yeah, call it in. They're used to getting multiple calls for traffic accidents, multiple calls for all sorts of things. Better to be safe than sorry, call it in. We don't have a sophisticated sense of monitors and sensors all over the place tracking if a fire has started. And another thing that does is, if you see, that calls to mind is if you see suspicious behavior, call it in, because we don't have a huge arson prevention campaign going. But, we can reduce that side of ignitions when people know that all of us are on alert, and we're going to call it in if we're a little worried that something weird is happening. So, use your discretion and your good judgment, but call in fires for sure. And also pay attention if there's been a lot of fires and there's some suspicious activity. We all need to be a part of making it really hard for the arson side of things to happen too.
Great. Well, I think we're a little overtime right now, but it was such a rich topic that you can barely cover it in an hour. So I wanted to thank you again, Elizabeth, for such a really great talk. It was so, I keep thinking I know everything I already know, and then I always learn something from these. So outstanding presentation. I did want to encourage people that if you missed anything and you wanted to watch it again and get some of the, the details refreshed, the recording of this presentation and all the HiSam presentations will be posted on the link that we've posted in the chat. And yeah, please share this webinar with people, because I think, it's really important for all of us. Like Elizabeth said, we're the first people responsible for protecting ourselves and our islands. So, please do everything you can to support them and to support each other. And with that, I will say mahalo to everyone for attending today. And we look forward to seeing you at future presentations. Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you.